If there was a man on earth who knew better than anyone that I was ridiculous, that man was I. Have you ever had the sense that life is empty or meaningless? Have there been times where you just cannot seem to care about the world anymore? Where continuing to struggle and strive seems completely pointless, and that it might be better just to give up entirely? Well, in the mid-19th century, Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky was pondering the implications of just such a mental state. He became fascinated with a swathe of people taking their own lives all across Russia, and he wrote The Dream of a Ridiculous Man to explore the inner workings of someone who just does not know how to go on, and how he thought such nihilism could be conquered. Spoilers ahead. The tale follows the eponymous ridiculous man, who has become convinced that nothing matters, and therefore he may as well die. On his way home to commit the deed, he comes across a small child in the street and thoughtlessly ignores her cries for help, chasing her away instead. He is tormented with guilt over this cruel action and falls into a deep sleep, dreaming that he is dead and has been transported to another world, where all people innocently love one another and everyone is happy and at peace. But he introduces the concept of lying into this world and watches as it slowly falls apart, taking on all the flaws of our reality and breaking into violent, warring factions. He suddenly awakes and finds he has a new lease on life and a new purpose to bring about the utopia he saw in his dream and guard it with his life. Get ready to learn how logic alone will lead us into self-destruction, why you cannot run from your own conscience, and how there is something uniquely noble about pursuing the impossible. This is one of Dostoevsky's richest and also most symbolic works, so more than ever please bear in mind that this is just my interpretation, and if you take something completely different from the story, that is absolutely fine. But with that out of the way, let's peer into the mind of despair. 1. The tragedy of reason. The classic philosophical question is, for what reason? It can be found in everyone from Plato to Leibniz, and it has carried us a long way. The wish to look for rational explanations for how events have come to pass. The urge to justify our own actions, and the drive to break more and more things down into logical components has served us incredibly well. It brought us the Enlightenment, modern medicine, and advanced mathematics. All things I'm very grateful for. But Dostoevsky wants to add a counterpoint to all of these benefits. He urges us not to seek perfect reason in every aspect of our lives, or else we will lose the dearest parts of our humanity. The driving force behind the ridiculous man's misery is his nihilism. But this is not the hedonistic nihilism that is sometimes found in Dostoevsky's characters and in wider literature. Instead, it simply robs our protagonist of the motivation to do anything. In some sense, he is a much more extreme nihilist than a mere egoist or hedonist, because while they might reject any sort of higher meaning, they still implicitly value something, their own pleasure or pain. But the ridiculous man is different. He acknowledges that he feels pain and that his physical sensations exist, but they don't seem to have much motivational tug on him. His disposition is such that only a rational meaning, independent from him or any other person, will throw him into action. Robbed of this, he simply sees no reason to carry on. He is not thrust into suicidality by some cataclysmic events that has made his life unbearably unpleasant, but is rather carried there, one step at a time, through the cold light of reason, and the stubborn refusal to turn to anything else. His condition reminds me of Albert Camus' concept of the absurd. The absurd is not the lack of objective meaning in the universe, but rather how this interacts with our innate hunger for such meaning. It is the suffering caused by the interaction of our primal search for a logical purpose in our lives, and the universe's rejection of this humble dream. The ridiculous man strikes me as someone with a particularly potent desire for objective meaning, and so when he cannot discover this by use of reason, he falls into existential despair. It is important to note here that Dostoevsky is not anti-reason. He is instead making the quite astute observation that we can't let reason be the only guiding force in our lives. Man cannot live on logic alone. Rationality is a fantastic way to answer how questions, but it often falls short in answering why questions. It can teach us how to build a steam engine, but it can't say why a steam engine would be desirable. It can chart the path to water, but it can't tell us why we should bother to drink. Part of what makes our protagonist so ridiculous, even at the beginning of the tale, is that he is clinging to logic to tackle a question it was never designed to answer. It is a fantastic tool to help us achieve an aim, but it needs this aim in order to function, or else it will flounder, not knowing where to point its conditional arrows. And this is not some airy-fairy position. Even David Hume, perhaps one of the most no-nonsense philosophers in history, used to say that reason was a slave to the passions. In Dostoevsky's mind, our narrator has been misled by the extreme utility of logic to believe that it alone can solve any issue. But this is just not true. It cannot solve existential questions by itself any more than it can paint a great work of art or hammer a nail. Sure, it will be involved in the process, but it is not the only piece of the puzzle. At least, this is what Dostoevsky seems to think. It is also this sole devotion to reason that causes the ridiculous man to treat the child so cruelly. We explicitly see inside his thought process, and in his own words, "If I was going to kill myself in 2 hours' time, then what did I care about that little girl?" And this makes perfect sense. If you're going to die pretty much immediately, then almost everything would seem completely pointless. After all, you aren't going to be around to suffer the consequences. Your entire world is about to blink out of existence. And surely, if the world was going to end in a couple of hours, then it would only be sentimentality that would make us care what went on in these final moments. But what makes the short story so interesting is that the ridiculous man has made a mistake. His reasoning is airtight. His perspective makes perfect sense. He is clever. He is logical. And he is wrong, because he is affected by his cruel actions. And that is just what we're going to look at next. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to either my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. The vicious conscience. Throughout history, there have been many ways people have tried to make sense of human conscience. Some ancient Greek thinkers thought of it like a lesser deity that would alert us when we're about to make a moral error, while some church fathers believed it to come straight from God himself. But one of my favourite representations of conscience is as a special form of torture. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, this manifests as an unbearable heartbeat ringing in the murderer's ears, while in Shakespeare's Macbeth it becomes the hallucination of bloodstains that can never be washed away. Here, conscience is not a gentle corrective force, but more like a stalking beast, tracking you through the dark night of your misdeeds and burying its teeth into the deepest recesses of your soul. And in Dostoevsky's short tale, it suddenly throws the narrator's worldview into question. The ridiculous man arrives home and sits down, but he feels his conscience gnawing at his side. He cannot make sense of this. Why would he feel guilty about being cruel to a child when he had already decided to end his own life and nothing even mattered in the first place? The ridiculous man has failed to realize that however much he may think that rationality is the solution to every problem, he is not a perfectly reason-guided being, and his emotions have something to say about his careless behavior. He suddenly feels like he cannot shoot himself just yet, not until he has solved the issue of his guilt and put his affairs of conscience back in order. It is at this moment where the ridiculous man drifts off into a dream where he has already committed his fatal deed and is now expired. There he encounters a world he describes as before the fall. That is what Dostoevsky thinks mankind would be like, without sin or selfishness. He describes people living in perfect harmony, overflowing with love at one another's presence. The ridiculous man explores this world and is in awe at the paradise on display. It is like heaven, but there is nothing directly supernatural going on. Rather, it is a heaven on earth, with the bountiful joy being brought by the sinless characters of the people that live there. They are described as possessing a sort of wisdom that the narrator cannot put into words, a sublime selflessness that he cannot completely understand. But this situation was not to last. The narrator inadvertently taught these innocent people how to lie, and it was all downhill from there. Once they learnt dishonesty, they grew to mistrust one another, splitting off into factions. Once there were factions, there was war. And once there was war, any hope of reclaiming their innocence was lost forever. The ridiculous man watches all of this with weeping. His guilty conscience has infected an entire species, and now they are all victims of his final act of cruelty towards this young girl. This dream has been interpreted and reinterpreted by hundreds of readers because it is so rich in meaning. It has clear theological undercurrents, a view of human nature that is both deeply optimistic and harshly pessimistic, and a powerful warning about how little it takes to turn a contented community into a violent, factional dystopia. But I interpret it, at least partly, as a great metaphor for the dominance of our conscience. The narrator introducing lying into this naive paradise is very similar to what happens when we commit an action that flies in the face of everything we value. The guilt and shame slowly spreads through our mind, filling every nook and cranny with its putrid fumes, until we are forced to either make peace with what we've done or continue to run from it, its snapping jaws ever at our heels, and its innumerable tendrils only one day away from dragging us into misery. And just as there is no clear logical sequence from the ridiculous man arriving in this paradise to the people learning to lie and their eventual moral downfall, There is a certain irrationality that guides our conscience. It is a terrifyingly chaotic force, which sometimes goes quiet enough to make us believe we have moved past our transgressions, and at other times howls in our ear so loudly we are convinced it will never stop. One moment it is content, the next it pounces. It is both the angel on our shoulder and the knife at our back. It can bring out the best of us through its righteous torment, and in a moment it can snatch away our peace of mind. Our protagonist's fatal error was believing that this eldritch beast could be tamed through logic and reason, when we are often simply at its mercy, and there is nothing we can do apart from comply with its demands. It is lucky then that it's a benevolent master, who is only holding us accountable to our own morality. This is truly a controversial image of our moral psychology, but I think that anyone with serious regrets in their life can relate to this twofold picture of our conscience. And in the case of the ridiculous man, his conscience does ultimately want what's best for him, as we shall soon see. 3. The lowest point and the highest. One of my favourite types of mythological stories that crop up again and again is where our hero descends to the land of the dead, only to emerge on the other side with some new insight or accomplishments to help them in their journey. It is found in the Odyssey, where Odysseus plunges into the depths of Hades to retrieve a prophecy from Tiresias, and in some strains of ancient Egyptian mythology, where the sun god Ra conquers demonic challenges in the night so he can rise the next morning. Arguably the most famous of these stories is that of Jesus Christ, who descended into hell and on the third day rose again. This imagery of dissension as development is found everywhere from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and in many ways the dream of a ridiculous man is another one of these narratives. The narrator falls into a dream where he has already killed himself and travels to a sort of afterlife. Then the afterlife slowly transforms into a personal hell, where his guilt and shame colour the horizon as far as the eye can see. But it is just at this moment that he wakes up with a new purpose, and a renewed sense that life is worth living and cherishing. This touches on a theme that Dostoevsky often explores in his works: the intense character changes that can accompany suffering, especially suffering of conscience. This is one of the dominant themes in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov is tormented by his own mind for the murder he has committed. It is found in Demons, where the sociopathic-seeming Nikolai Stavrogin breaks down in front of a monk in a now infamous and villainous confession. And it is always interesting to see where he takes these stories. Sometimes it is the first step in a new life we never get to see. Sometimes it is the last gasp of a despairing man soon to meet a rotten fate. But in this story, the ridiculous man has perhaps the most optimistic ending possible, because we actually get to see the positive transformation he has undergone. In an instant, his intense suffering becomes a realization, and we experience the joy forming on his face as he finds meaning in life again. He describes the dream as truth, while still acknowledging that none of it happened. The point for him is not that it is true in the normal sense, but rather that it is held as an article of existential faith. Put a pin in that, as I'll revisit it shortly. And the ridiculous man freely admits that other people will laugh at him and decry him as a fool. He does not even reproach them for it. In fact, he totally understands. From their perspective, it is only right and proper. They have not undergone his emotional journey and emerged on the other side. And amongst all this symbolism is a very powerful message. Dostoevsky often paints a picture of humanity in his books that gives equal respect to both their rational and emotional natures. But here, this reaches its pinnacle, as we are confronted with something like an emotional revelation. His experience is difficult to put into words, but I'm sure that lots of you will have gone through something like this yourselves. It might be the sudden realization in the face of abuse that you are worthy of respect. Or it might suddenly dawn from you in a moment of heartache how much you love someone. Or you feel a pain in your bones that can only be assuaged by helping other people. Such realizations are partly rational, but they have a huge emotional component that is often overlooked. Importantly, they often transform extreme suffering into extreme joy in a moment. And Dostoevsky highlights this perfectly through his short tale. The ridiculous man fell asleep, descended into hell, and arose again with his spirit restored. He follows in the mighty footsteps of Odysseus, Ra, and Christ, and carries with him a very similar message. Sometimes it is just when things are at their most unpleasant and most unbearable that our entire existence shifts for the better. Of course, I want to add here that we can't infer from this that all suffering is good. This is a nuanced exploration of just one kind of experience. But what realizations did the ridiculous man come to, and how should this bear on our own lives? To answer this, we will need some help, and we need to consult some of Dostoevsky's wider philosophy. 4. Faith and transformation. I personally don't have religious faith, but I really envy those that do. When I reflect on the amount of strength that faith has given people, how much torment they've been able to endure in its name, I am genuinely humbled. Tales of self-immolating Buddhist monks and early Christians executed for not recanting their religion really get to me, because it shows they have access to a kind of resolve that I am cut off from. And in the final pages of his story, Dostoevsky illustrates both the tragic and restorative powers of faith in a literary masterstroke. When the ridiculous man wakes up from his dream, he sees his new purpose as bringing about the kind of paradise he saw before it was corrupted. He wants to teach mankind to love one another as brothers. He melds together classic Christian teachings with the even more radical idea that this will create a heavenly existence here, on the material plane. And he says he will preach this for the rest of his life. This is the new meaning granted to him. And it is this that makes him change his mind and not end his own existence. On the face of it, this is a straightforwardly optimistic story. It mirrors how Dostoevsky came to his own Orthodox Christian faith and how this gave him resolve for the rest of his life. It paints a genuinely hopeful picture of a person at his lowest finding new purpose in universal love. However, taken in conjunction with Dostoevsky's other works, it begins to sting of tragedy as well. In Notes from the Underground, there is a very famous passage where Dostoevsky gives what many take to be his interpretation of the darkest parts of human nature. He says that if mankind were living in a utopia, they would still revolt and suffer for lack of pain. There is a deep, unconquerable part of ourselves that craves suffering, craves separation from other people, and wishes to stew in resentment, anger, and envy. If we accept this, then the ridiculous man's quest is doomed from the start, because the kind of universal love he preaches is simply contrary to how we are built. Even if we ignore that, we can see that the ridiculous man's vision of paradise was so fragile that the mere presence of someone not entirely selfless was enough to destroy it. Even if our narrator manages to bring about this world for a single moment, it will collapse just as quickly. And any reader will almost certainly know that the ridiculous man's dream is unrealistic. Even the most devout Christians tend to say that we can only be made free of sin by God, not just through the preachings of an eccentric Russian dreamer. But despite this tragic element, I think that the overall message is hopeful, optimistic, and above all, beautiful. It might not be that the ridiculous man achieves his aim, or even that he comes close. There is every chance that he spends the rest of his life preaching his message without making a single dent on the selfishness and avarice of mankind. But from his perspective, this does not matter. He will have devoted his life to a cause he believes in more than anything else. In his classic fashion, Dostoevsky delivers a message that is full of pathos yet brimming with joy. We may strive after higher goals that we have no hope of ever bringing about or achieving, but instead of this making our lives pointless or empty, it is the very thing that fills them. A purpose in life is sometimes called someone's North Star, and this metaphor makes a lot of sense. The North Star guides sailors in the night and helps them navigate without the use of the sun. But Dostoevsky's story completes the metaphor. No matter how much sailing someone does, they will never reach the North Star. It is light years away, forever out of our grasp, but just because we will never get there does not diminish its utility, nor does it mean it should not chart our course. Its light tells us where we must turn to reach our next momentary destination, and its constant presence stops us from getting lost in the blinding darkness of the night. So far from being hopeless, the dream of a ridiculous man brings with it the comforting message that even if the purpose of our lives will never be achieved, that is absolutely fine. The point of meaning is not to be conquered but to be followed, and for us to keep at its tail as it recedes into the distance. The thrill is in the chase rather than the capture. And however irrational or illogical it may seem, it is better to embark on a doomed journey rather than never to set off at all. As always, I encourage you to read the story for yourself, as there is so much I've been unable to talk about. For instance, the religious imagery is complicated and fascinating, and I've only been able to scratch the surface of it here. And if you're interested in exploring Dostoevsky's philosophy further, then click here to learn the warning he gives to lovers. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.